Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Club Book with Jayne Anne Phillips. I'm Peter Guy. I'll be in conversation with Jayne Anne this evening. I'm the author of a handful of novels, including Wintering and the Ski Jumpers. And in April next year, my sixth novel, A Lesser Light, will be out. Before I introduce tonight's guest properly, allow me a moment to tell you a bit more about the unique series that is bringing her to us tonight. Club Book is a program of MELSA, the Metropolitan Library Service Agency, made possible through Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and coordinated by Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. Ramsey County Library is the co-organizer of this evening's talk. Thanks also to partnering bookseller Red Balloon Bookshop, the fabulous Red Balloon Bookshop. A purchase link to Night Watch will be available in the comments section of this live stream feed. Have it shipped, pick it up at their lovely store in St. Paul, or have them deliver it personally to your door if you're close to their shop. One final housekeeping note. Also in the comments, you'll see a survey link. MELSA would greatly appreciate hearing what you think of this Club Book program. It's quick and easy, and it really does make a difference. Our guest tonight, the Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Jayne Anne Phillips, has been a defining voice in American literature for nearly half a century. A recent review lauded her 1979 debut, Black Tickets, as a short story collection that remains so compellingly singular that it ought to function as a handbook for short story writers. It won the inaugural and prestigious Sue Kaufman Prize for first fiction. Phillips' later work cemented her legacy as a writer who uses fiction as a tool to give voice to the downtrodden, marginalized, and forgotten. Works of special note include her first novel, Machine Dreams, from 1984, Shelter from 1994, National Book Award finalist Lark and Termite from 2009, and Quiet Dell in 2013. All are period pieces set in the author's native West Virginia. Her latest novel, Night Watch, exhibits these and other trademarks of Phillips' craft. Set in a backwoods asylum in the bleak, near-apocalyptic aftermath of the Civil War, Night Watch garnered a host of literary honors, including the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. After a short talk by our guest, and some initial questions from me, we'll have time for audience Q&A. Simply drop your question in the comments thread here on Facebook, and our tech manager will route them to me. You can also send a message to Club Book through Facebook Messenger or email. We're at clubbookmn@gmail.com. Jayne Anne, it's so nice to be in your company tonight, even if we are half a continent apart from each other. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a few things about my impressions of this book that, as I told you, I liked so much I read twice. It's been a long time since I read a novel that worked on me in so many ways as this one did. The language itself, which from the first word to the last is beautiful and authentic. The sweeping and horrifying and beautiful spectrum of the human experience that you evoke in this, from the battlefields of the Civil War to the embrace of a mother's or a daughter's arms to the quiet conversations between a doctor and a patient, all of them mesmerized me. And the cast of characters are so incredibly invented, so human, so injured, and so resilient. I don't remember the last time I read a book and was so moved by them. One other thought that occurred to me as I read this is that the architecture of this novel, which does not go linearly, starts in one period of time and goes back and then comes back to another period of time before bouncing to still another, is magnificent. And altogether, it's just a staggering achievement. And I'm so excited to be in conversation with you tonight.
Well, Peter, it sounds like you're my ideal reader.
I might very well be. I think that might very well be the case. If it's okay, I thought I would begin with a quote um, from a review in the Wall Street Journal, written by Sam Sachs, and it says, "Phillips is a principled practitioner of narrative magic. Not only serendipity, but a kind of clairvoyance connects the characters. Goodness is a real thing in this novel, a verifiable force. And the question posed is whether we still have the sensitivity to discern it." I think that's a fascinating observation, not least because of all the pain and brutality that exists right beside the goodness. I'm thinking here of the Civil War itself, of course, which is like a cloud that hangs over this novel. And I'm wondering how this Civil War era novel first occurred to you, and how does goodness play a part in it from your perspective?
Well, I started writing as a poet. Um, so I would say I'm a language-oriented writer. I hear sort of the first few pages, first paragraph or whatever of a novel that I may be spending many years on. And I still compose line by line. So the sound of the line, the weight of the syllables, the way that the line sits on the page is very important to me. This book first occurred to me in the first section that's from Connelly's point of view. Many times that piece that begins the book may end up at the end of the book or in the middle of the book, but in this um, book, it really began with Connelly's voice and that hurried rush into the buckboard and the character of Papa and the idea that she's about to start a journey that she has no idea. She has no idea where that journey will end. And I, as the writer at that time, had no idea either. Of course, I knew they were going to the asylum, but I did not know how the book would work, how it would be put together. But in terms of thinking about the idea of goodness, I'm not an optimist. Yet I think at every point in history, there are those nameless, forgotten individuals who operate as moral fulcrums, no matter what loss or threat they suffer. That is, they just persist in trying to move forward through love of someone, love of their families, the need to protect, the need to sustain. And I think D'Urville is such a character. And she refers to her adopted son as her one or my one. He's known as sharpshooter during the war and later lent the name John O'Shea by his doctor. His identity shifts as he inhabits one life after another. Night Watch is actually a position at the asylum, and that ended up being the title of the novel because I feel as though it embraces more than just the name of one character or one job at the asylum. Namelessness is a theme in the book because the characters begin as fugitives. This is not a past they share with Connelly. But even before the war, Connelly, Eliza, D'Urville keep their family names secret for reasons that unspool throughout the novel. I wanted the revelations not to happen sort of at one point, but to sort of continue. And you, as someone who read the novel twice, are probably very aware of that. I was thinking also of Rembrandt's famous painting, The Night Watch, which I believe was painted in 1642. It's that beautiful rendering of a group of men sitting in this dark, cavernous space. They're wearing these amazing, huge hats. And they are, in fact, the night watchmen of their various cities. So I saw both the man that we come to know at the end of the book, this is a spoiler, as Ephraim Connolly. He's a man whose past is lost to him. In fact, he never knows, even before he goes to the war, his true background, his real story. Yet these two characters, I think, comprise a kind of goodness in every act they undertake. And it really is about a time of terrible brutality. And the irony, of course, and the heart of the book is that this asylum, which we normally think of as a kind of prison environment, was actually a refuge. And it turns their lives around, or begins to turn their lives around, and gives them the strength to continue.
I want to circle back to that idea of goodness and to the redemptive quality of some of the characters a little later. But on this subject of non-linear storytelling, maybe this is non-linear interviewing happening simultaneously here.
Okay.
I thought that one of the most interesting parts of the story is the way that it moves back and forth through time. I love a novel that does that. Most of the novels I've written myself do that. And I'm not sure why that's true of myself, but I'm curious to hear why you began the novel where you did in 1874, before going back to what might be considered the origin of the 1874 section with the 1864 section, and then moving back and forth through time like that. I mean, why did you do that? And what do you think the effect of that is?
Well, when I began the book, I wasn't necessarily planning to do that, but I wrote that whole first section, which really you are with the characters as they encounter and suffer terrible traumas. You also see their resourcefulness and the love they have for one another. You witness life in the mountains in this, I think, as being a kind of wonderful pre-industrial time when the natural world is such a force. So we experience all of that. And then in the 1864 section, we go back 10 years and we sort of encounter the same characters and find out why they are as they are when we meet them, why they sort of who they are. And then we go forward so that we meet them and then we begin to understand their pasts. And hopefully the reader is completely taken up by that. I wanted to read from the very beginning of the book. This is a reading of about, I'd say, 4 minutes. And the book begins in the first person voice of Connolly. She's the only character who speaks in the first person, and she's 12 years old. So this is Connolly, A Journey, April 1874. I got up in the wagon and Papa set me beside Mama, all of us on the buckboard seat. Hold her hand there, he said to me, like she likes. Sit tight in, keep her still. I saw him lean down and rope her ankle to his. Talk to her, he said. Tell her she'll like it where she's going. A fine, great place, like a castle with a tower clock. Tell her. You'll like it, Mama, I said. Tell her about them palms. Palm trees and pots, Mama, and velvet sofas, like in a city hotel. And don't call her Mama, he said. Don't you see how she's dressed? He'd got the dress from a widow man who was giving away his dead wife's carpet bag and clothes, the petticoats, silk underthings, skirts, satin bodice, and jacket. You know what to call her, he said. Don't fail in it. You said call her Miss Janet, though it's not her name. It is her name now. Her old name won't do her good. Call her by her name. I will, just in a minute, catching my breath. But I put my hand on hers. She was clasping her knees so hard I could feel her shake. I was out of breath from carrying the babbies to the neighbor women. One of them would take the boy because he was walking and talking, and the boy twin if she got both boys. The other woman would take the girl twin, so that was a separate trip, pulling the drag with the bags of flour and salt. I guess we were going to be gone some days driving over to Weston. Papa, who's going to feed the chickens while we're gone and find the eggs? That neighbor woman, he said, that took the girl twin. Mama never named the babbies. We only called them so, the babbies, and she nursed all three. The twins were but 12 weeks. Skipping forward a bit. Dusk of the second day, I could see the glow of a town, but knew he wouldn't go through it. He found dirt roads and meadow trails and kept a pair of clippers for snapping barbed wire. He could twist it back together and leave no sign of passage. He liked to say about all he knew, staying hid so you could see and not be seen, which roots and leaves to eat if you stayed hid, how to fish with a bent safety pin and a length of rush, how to see the holes where animals lived and set a trap from lengths of green saplings so thin even a child could bend them and so sharp they pierced the flesh. Never to live in a town, but always on country land, deep in shelter where few passed, like where we lived, high on the ridge. I supposed he'd put us there, and so knew where to find us. What could that town be, I asked him, there between the hills? Not Weston, he said, not yet. You always know how to go, I said. I know my way, he said. Been through here, even to Weston back in '64 with Whitaker's raiders. The asylum was half built, already like a castle. Camp asylum it was then, with the Union boys just pulled out. We took all the blankets and every scrap from the larder. The South was eating bark by then and whatever we could steal. Here, take the reins. The horse went on. He was quiet, napping, catnapping, he called it, how you kept going when you were on the move. We were under a stand of pines so close I could smell the needles. A great owl looked down at me, blinking its round orange eyes. It spread its great wings and gathered, rowing the air like water. The owl flew over me and was gone. I saw that its white feathers were dappled with black. Papa startled. What was that? An owl, I said. Flew out from the trees, straight across. Screecher, was it? Might have been. He took the reins. Or maybe barn owl. Good omen, they say. You wouldn't have seen one before because you never had a barn. Did you? Did I what? Ever have a barn? Of course I had a barn, he said. You and your mama sure never had a barn. He clicked his mouth at the horse and snapped the reins. I was thinking we were far from barns out here, and a name was not a given. He'd named Mama to suit himself, called her Mrs. until he called her Miss Janet, and said my name wrong, Connolly instead of Connolly, but a name meant nothing to the owl. It lived wild and might live in these very pines. Are we nearly there? I asked him. Soon, he said. Just after dawn, we stopped and I sat up. Papa had braked the buckboard on a wide dirt road. A railroad track lay to one side, then a thin run of stream in the back of a town. To the other side was a great lawn. It was first light, and the stone walls looked more blue than gray. There was the clock tower, and above it a spire like a church. No cross, only a point. Didn't I tell you? Papa said, 200 feet tall. It's a wonder, I said. Should I walk with her inside? She's not going in without you, he said. Then he fixed me in his gaze. Connolly, he said, how old are you? He should have known, but I told him. I'll be 13 at the end of December, born after you went away. Born in '61, the year both sides mustered troops. Tall for your age, but right puny, too skinny for a man to take on. I considered it, but you'll stay with her. Here? This is home. There's nothing back there. It's all giveaway. It's giveaway? Are you listening to me? Yes, sir, I said. He leaned down and pointed his finger at me until he touched my throat, just at the little notch of bone. Then listen, he said, I am not your papa, nor have I ever been. I never laid eyes on you or your mama till I came upon you, and you don't know my name. It was true. She'd never called him a name, only at first he bade us call him papa, and she never said different. So don't be looking for me, he said, or tell anyone where you come from. I only rode you here as a kindness. You was walking along the road, and because she was a quality woman in need of refuge, I rode you here. It was on my way. Tell me so. You rode us here, I said. It was on your way. Miss Janet's a quality woman, he said, with no dependents nor family. You're not her family, but a servant. Nowhere to go but with her. Sir, I said. Times is hard, he said, and flicked the reins. You'll tell the story. The wagon was moving off, and his words drifted back with the dust. I wished so hard we'd arrived at night when no one could see us for me to think on our situation. But the sky had lightened, and there was no time. I hoisted Mama's carpet bag and took her arm. We walked slowly along the gravel path. There was no use asking her about Papa, if it was true. We'd no relatives I knew of. We lived in Virginia, but now we were not Virginia. I knew from Papa that the name of our state had changed more than once, that West Virginia had betrayed the South and stood for the Union. If Papa was for the South, I was for the Union, and Mama was surely with me. I stood Mama just beside me and knocked on the huge black door. I heard the sound of locks opening and bolts sliding, and the door half opened. A tall man, broad in the shoulders, stood looking down at us. He was dressed almost like a train conductor, all in black, and his cap was round with a round bill. He wore a patch that covered his left eye from brow to cheekbone with a livid scar beneath. It was not so fearful or unusual then to see the bandaged or the maimed. I made my voice steady. "Good day," I said. "I've brought Miss Janet for her rest and cure." "The staff does not receive at this hour," he said. I felt myself thrown forward then, for my mother had fallen against me with all her weight. I was half in the entrance, my ribs hard against the marble doorstep, and felt him lift her from me as the door swung wide. He pulled me to my feet with one hand as he shut the door behind us and threw the bolt into place. Then he was carrying her across the round, empty room as though she was a child. I ran after them with her carpet bag. "She's faint," I was saying. He had stopped and put her on a chaise and taken a vial from his pocket. "Ammoniac," he said, "to revive her." He took the small cork from the vial and held it to her nose. She started and drew in her breath, gasping, and opened her eyes on his face that was close to hers. Her gaze widened as though she knew him. Of course she didn't, but I was grateful she didn't seem afraid. I saw now that his eye patch wasn't made of cloth, but of something harder, rounded tin or metal covered with felt, held in place with straps. A scar like an angry bloom was on his temple. But she seemed to sense a sudden protection or counsel. Then he stepped back and she looked wildly around. I reached down to grasp her shoulder. "Miss Janet," I remembered to say, "you were faint. We've come to the asylum." "The cooks are not in yet," said our benefactor, "but I've some victuals set out. I'm O'Shea, the night watch. Can you walk, miss?" He looked at me when she didn't answer. "Girl," he said, "if you'll bring her." And he turned on his heel. Our shoes, Mama's and mine, clicked on the marble floor. His footsteps were silent, and such a big man. Then I saw that he'd thick woolen covers tied over his boots. So I'll stop there.
It's just such an arresting opening and so much to wonder about. And one of the reasons I was drawn to rereading the book was because I wanted to circle back. By the time you get to the end of the book, of course, there are many revelations, and those revelations paint such a different picture of the opening. But they've, of course, landed here at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, which plays an enormous role in the novel. It's a site of many, many scenes and of course, much of the healing that takes place in the novel. Maybe you could comment on that. And also, there is throughout the novel, I might have counted them, countless, dozens maybe, photographs and historical artifacts, pictures that you've incorporated into the text itself. And many of them are of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Maybe you can comment on those two things.
Well, I grew up in a small town that was only about 20-minute drive from what we referred to as the Weston State Hospital. At that time, it was horribly overcrowded and it soon shut down. But as I began to research the book, I discovered a whole different asylum. At this point, the asylum has been purchased by a private citizen, purchased from the state of West Virginia for $3 million because the state didn't know what to do with it. It was falling into ruin. The local police were fond of having paintball battles inside the building. And I discovered not only the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, but its author, so to speak, a psychiatrist at that time called the chief physician, he was the chief physician of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, and he imported something called moral treatment from Europe. This was a revolutionary idea that had to do basically with treating the mentally ill with dignity. He was also the architect of the buildings themselves, which are still referred to as Kirkbride buildings. Every state at that time was encouraged to create one of these huge facilities for the insane of their state, both the poor and the wealthy. They incorporated 200 to 300 acres of land. This book, published in 1854, was the sort of primer on how to build a state asylum. And the states followed his recommendations pretty much to the letter. This book is published by something called the Forgotten Books Press. And they're actually his words. The asylum in West Virginia was one of the largest. It was was hand-hewn sandstone from a quarry nearby. It enclosed 9 miles of interior space. The buildings themselves ran along the ground for over a quarter of a mile. And yet, with all of this space, Kirkbride's command was that every patient have their own private room with 2 windows and a transom over the door, because country air and space and light were considered very important. The food was grown on the premises for the most part. They had their own dairy, their own gardens, their own blacksmith. And he believed that each person should have their own regimen. And this was a very clear, tight schedule of the entire day. People came out of their rooms in the morning for breakfast. The room was locked, and they weren't going back to their room until after dinner. Walks of 4 to 5 miles a day through these segregated walking trails, one side for men and one side for women, was part of everyone who could walk, I suppose, had this physical regimen, was really part of what they did. So it was an amazing place. And his dictums held fast for maybe 30 years. He grew older, he died. His methods were ignored, and all of these asylums began to overcrowd. And it's really fitting that, at least I think it's very fitting, that the asylum now has become a nonprofit, tala.org, TALA.org. And the name has been restored to the original name, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum.
That's just such a fascinating story, and it seems so almost quaint to think of treating the ill with such tenderness and care as the book describes. And it's described in two ways. First, through your magnificent storytelling, but also, and frequently, there are excerpts from the book that you just held up to show everyone as chapter epigraphs. So
exactly, there's an epigraph in every chapter that comes directly from Kirkbride.
Yeah.
Or most of them.
But excuse me. So there's like this, here is the historical document, and now I'm going to imagine what this was like. And a considerable part of that care and treatment is, as you described it, the moral treatment that Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride invented and carried out. What is it? How did it work? And who was he in real life?
He published this book, that I showed you in 1854. And so even before the Civil War, he was the basic, the authority, probably the most famous physician in the United States for the next 20 or 30 years. I don't really know why this sort of happened to coincide with the Civil War. It was just such a beautiful thing to think about them together. the idea of moral treatment. I was once going to call the book Moral Treatment. My publishers refused to let me call it that. But even the words are so really powerful that there is a morality involved in the way we treat people, and particularly in the way that institutions treat people. I'll read a very short piece. Connelly and her mother have arrived at the asylum, and they're having their first interview with a character I invented. He's a nephew, an invented nephew of Thomas Story Kirkbride, and his name is Thomas Kirkbride Story. Matron Bowman tells me, Miss Janet, here he looked at Mama, that you were brought to us by a passing stranger and that Miss Connelly accompanied you on your journey. Mama looked up, attentive, and never glanced at me. He moved to sit in the chair just beside her. Was it a difficult journey? He asked. She too leaned forward and nodded slowly. Perhaps she would speak to him. I almost hoped. Did anyone hurt you on the journey? Dr. Story paused, or before the journey? I held my breath, afraid she might reply. Miss Janet, Dr. Story said, I hope you will speak with me in time. We shall meet every other day here in the office to help you acclimate. My mother turned to him. She said, yes. It was a soft voice, her new voice that struck no chord in me. I thought I remembered that we had sung and shouted and laughed, that she would read to me long and long until I fell asleep. Years when we were alone with only the seasons and the animals and Dervla and other neighbor women, more of them in that time before. Very well then, he told Mama. The doctor turned to me like a warmth that searched and found me. Miss Connelly, he asked, how long have you known the patient? 2 years about, I said, careful, but I seldom heard her speak in that time, like she did just now to you. Can you tell me the cause of the fire that destroyed Miss Janet's home? He seemed generous, but saw into me, I knew. Was the cause discovered? He asked. It was at night, I answered. A lightning strike, some said, or spilled kerosene. No one knew, but the family I worked for moved north the next day to their kin because someone killed their stock, their chickens, the cows, the horses. The night of the fire. I'd said too much. Now he might ask for names, the homesteads, the family, the town, but he did not. Many have suffered, he said, and suffer now, especially here in this border state. The fighting has ceased, but not the grief. He seemed to read my thoughts better than I could think them. And Miss Janet has no family, Dr. Story asked. No children? She has no children, I managed to say, far as I know. No one mentioned such. She was always called Miss Janet. It may be she was betrothed, but so many went to the war. He interrupted me. Miss Connelly, there's clearly a bond between you. I would like to employ you as Miss Janet's attendant to share her room and look after her and accompany her on her assigned regimen. But I can pay you only in room and board for the present. Dr. Story, I told him, I want to stay very much. On a trial basis, he said. This must be understood. You see, Miss Connelly, a strict regimen, including physical activity, a walk of some 3 to 5 miles a day, croquet or hoops on the lawn, carriage rides in late afternoon, is essential. I nodded, wondering if he would discover who my mother really was. I didn't know truth from memory myself anymore. She'd shot deer and killed and dressed them, always with Dervla. I remember them working in brimmed hats, leather gloves to their elbows, pulling and cutting, the slide of steaming guts tumbling out on the ground and the carcasses hung up. I heard the crack of a rifle in the woods and the thud of running and scuffling near my hiding place. I pushed at the cool stones set in the walls of the root cellar and did not know why, but Dr. Story was speaking. His voice gathered me in. You will see, Miss Connelly, he said, we provide firm, sympathetic structure, healthy air and food, a refuge from family and strife. Our approach is known as moral treatment. Many can be cured with humane treatment, and the incurable treated humanely. It seemed a riddle, but the interview was over. So that's moral treatment in Dr. Story's words.
Well, and then we get to see it over the course of Miss Janet's time at the Trans Allegheny insane lunatic asylum. Um, it's not long after that scene, the scene that you just read, that we get our first experience with the war. Um, and it is a remarkable scene that you write and describe. Uh, visual to the point of cinema, harrowing and terrifying, uh, and unforgettable. And I've heard you mention that Night Watch is the third novel in a war trilogy
Mhm.
that include your earlier novels, Machine Dreams and Lark and Termite. Those novels were written about 15 and about, is that 40 years ago, respectively?
Yes,
And
sir.
I wonder if you can speak to this and how this theme or how this fact of American history and life has been a part of your imagination and a part of your work over all of those years.
Well, my books always have a connect to history. Quiet Dell, for instance, is set at the beginning of the Depression in 1932 and is based on the real case of a multiple murder. Machine Dreams was about a civil war between North and South Vietnam. That is, it's the story of a family at home, really, although there are also war scenes in that book. Um, Lark and Termite is focused on or refers to a real incident early in the Korean War, the incident called No Gun Re. And I patterned what happened after a real account that broke in the New York Times when I'd already begun the novel, which then concerned these children in a small West Virginia town in the 1950s. A sister and her brother. Lark is the sister, and Termite is the name of the child, who is born with very severe disabilities. He's in fact born as his father is dying in the tunnel at No Gun Re, and the connections between them begin to play out in the book in a way that is almost clairvoyant, I suppose you would say. And after I finished that book, I realized that I needed to look at our Civil War, which was also a North-South, a battle between North and South. And I was also influenced, as we all have been, by this striking similarities between the time of the Civil War and the time we're living in. It's a time of tribal affinities, lack of dialogue, breakdown in government, scarce resources, and conspiracy theories. There were so many conspiracy theories during the Civil War. And of course, that's magnified a millionfold by the fact that we now live with the internet. But I found there to be so many similarities between what people were actually experiencing, the migrations from areas where they couldn't continue to live, the separation of families, the long journeys, and the family losing touch with one another and having to travel great distances, both in mind and in body, to try to find one another again. At that point, I began to see them as a trilogy, and I saw the way that they were related to one another.
Do you think that it's the or a responsibility of the historical novelist or the novelist who writes about history anyway for their story that's set in the past to somehow reflect on or amplify the moment that we live in now?
Well, I don't think you can make that happen as a writer unless it's organic to the book. I think that's what happens in good fiction, that fiction is a form of time travel. I mean, if it's working, the reader should really feel what the protagonist feels. I mean, people have said to me when I read your books, I don't feel as though I'm just reading them, I feel as though I'm inside them. And that remark pleases me very much because that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I feel as though language has many, many dimensions, and that the reader brings their own past, their own experience, their own unconscious to the book. Everyone reads the book differently, but it hopefully connects on a very sensory level so that we actually begin to feel as though, you know, we're in that time. We have some sense of what that time was. And it can't help but shed a kind of light on what we're living in today. I mean, the Civil War casts a long shadow, and we're still in that shadow.
Yeah. I have just a couple more questions that I'll ask, and then I'll grudgingly turn it over to the audience so they can ask you a few questions as well. So I often think a good novel or even a great novel has, you know, uh, 5 or 10 scenes that the author can really hang their hat on and say that is the scene that when I got to the end of that scene, I knew I was on to something, or that the reader, when they're reflecting on the experience of reading the story, say, I'm never going to forget that moment when, or something to that effect. And I've always held as a standard, like I said, this 5 or 10 scene minimum. What was amazing to me about reading Night Watch is that virtually every scene exists that way in my memory of reading it. And I think that that's a testament, of course, to your skill as a novelist, but also to that evocation that you describe, where the reader finds themselves inhabiting the novel. And I wonder if you think about your work as you're doing it as a series of scenes. I mean, you mentioned earlier the story coming to you via Connolly's voice. But as it evolves, as you begin to make progress, and as these other characters and other elements of the novel take shape, how do you then think about it? Is it a series of scenes built on top of the next, or is it something else for you altogether?
No, it's like a kind of funnel cloud that I'm walking through. I mean, I think of myself as someone blindfolded walking through a dark wood. um, if I'm stuck, I read the paragraph that I've lately written, and if I still don't know where to go, I go back to the page before, or the 12 pages before, or I start reading the book again from the first page, because I feel as though it should kind of evolve from itself. I love the idea of the reader knowing far more than the characters know. And the idea of, I mean, I feel as though clairvoyance, or a sense of connection, you could call it, is present in our everyday lives. But I'm going to read one paragraph. It's not from the actual scene of the battle in Battle of the Wilderness, but it's just the prelude to the battle in which the sharpshooter is basically scouting as a picket. Daybreak, he moved forward with the pickets to sight any rebel scouting Union forces. They passed small canvas tents and the Union hospital, half erected near the Orange Plank Road, and soundlessly penetrated more dense woods. Owls called out a series of warnings. They saw no enemy, but the sharpshooter felt a gravity pulsing under him. live as a deep river whose might, curtailed by obstruction, built to implacable force. The others seemed not to feel the low charge of the ground, but he trusted his sense and sight, the hallucinatory glow of the skinny trees, and he slipped through the pines to sight a small dogwood in abundant blossom. The pink-tipped branches held themselves in symmetry, unscarred, untouched. The turn of the open petals brought to mind the smooth inner palm of a woman's hand, and he suddenly imagined that Eliza was very near him. He stepped closer. The petals trembled almost imperceptibly, and then again, as though pulsed by distant footfall. He stepped closer. Then he returned to the Union encampment and urgently reported a considerable force moving toward them, but no one had seen sight of a single Confederate in the nearly 3 mile they had scouted. His report was dismissed. The pickets were called in and told to rest. Last night's dark had seemed too perilous to admit sleep, but the May morning was mellow. Men fell to dozing against each other. The sharpshooter cleaned his infield, disassembling and assembling the works. He'd stopped carrying his sharpshooter's saber because sabers were heavy and cumbersome, but he felt a keen disadvantage in this place that would likely force one man against another. A whippoorwill shrieked its vibrato in the trees and shrieked again, mocking him. He left off thinking and tried to locate the bird. Listening, he knew the look of them, their mottled brown markings and small white spots, with the white necklace on the throat like a preacher's collar. But the whippoorwill fell silent.
Oh, what comes after that is truly unforgettable. Before we turn to the audience questions, and there are already several terrific questions in the chat, I wonder if you'll answer one more.
Sure.
And I hope it's a fair question, an interesting question. When I read a novel like Night Watch, I can't help think about the bloody history of this country and how in so many ways war and violence seem to be one of our defining features, if not our defining feature. I'm speaking now of America. It seems more and more the rest of the world as well. And that one of the consequences of that violence is, of course, the healing that has to come afterwards. And that healing in this novel is largely undertaken by the women characters. And now I felt hopeful at the end of this novel. And I wonder if you think that's a fool's hope or not.
Absolutely not. We only have ourselves and the people we care about, and we can only try to do what we can to protect them and to protect our communities. And we like to think of that word community as a larger and larger word. It seems to be the history or the makeup of human beings, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that there's constant fear-mongering and othering, separating people, encouraging tribal affinities that lead to one war after another. And that's certainly true in the case of America. And we see it happening, well, all around the world now, because there's been a complete surge of populist, violent leaders who are concerned about gaining territory and controlling their populations. It's a very difficult and strange time. How are we going to live through this month? But we have to, I mean, there is definitely a sense of connection between people, and that is the effect that we can have. And we may find occasions to use that power in our own lives as time goes by. That is hope. That's the only hope.
That's beautifully said. Let's turn to a couple of these questions that have rolled across our thread here. The first one says, I've read all of Jayne Anne Phillips' books and wonder if the author could perhaps speak to why she finds West Virginia such a fertile setting for her stories. What do you think about that?
That's a good question. I think because that's where I happened to be born. My family on both sides had been there since the 1700s. So I think the feel of the place, the natural landscape, the mountains, the isolation of the mountains is just something that is bred in the bone, kind of generation after generation in such a place. I think too that I'm very drawn to the first inklings of identity in adolescent girls, when they begin to separate from their families and perceive things through themselves. And because I grew up there, when I write about children and characters, I see that landscape. I think it's a small town landscape that has so much in common with towns all over America. And I think that is something that people who came from rural areas or small towns sort of feel a kind of connect to a lot of the settings of my books. But for me, West Virginia was just a great place to be born because it is a place of such complexity and such mournfulness and such beauty. You know, it's so when I think of a period of time and a story, I tend to think of it happening there, although of course my books go many, many places, and not everything that I've written is set there, but it somehow connects. Yeah.
Do you think of yourself in that way as what is commonly referred to as a regional novelist?
No, I hate that term.
Tell us why you hate that term.
Because I think it's a diminishing of a writer's grasp or power to say that it's a regional thing. One is writing about a region. I'm not writing about a region. I'm writing about human beings and history. And I'm often talking about a place that, because I left it, can be extremely powerful for me. I could not have stayed there. It would be like continuing to live in my family of origin all my life. And in order to find what I wanted to do and the way in which I wanted to write, I had to travel great distances and wander.
Wonderful. Here's another question from the group. Is Dearbla based in whole or in part on a person or people from that era? I adore narratives with nature healers and herbalists, but have never encountered this kind of character in American historical fiction. And then a parenthetical, she was my favorite character remark.
Well, Dearbla, spelled Dearbhla, was actually the name of a neighbor of mine. One of their children was called Dearbla. I used to pronounce it. And of course, I found later that in Irish, it's pronounced Dervla. There were a great many Irish immigrants to the States. We think of them as arriving in New York, but in fact, many of them immigrated to the South. And many of them came as workers who signed contracts to work for a plantation for a number of years, a decade, 2 decades. And Dervla is a descendant of such a family. So there is I read books about whites in the South and the Irish in the South. So there is a reality to her history, but none of the characters are based on real people. It's simply too long ago. I dedicated the book to my grandfathers and I guess she was my grandmother's great aunt Jenny, who welcomed her husband back from one of the worst prisons in the South. Not because they have anything to do with the book as characters, but because to them, the Civil War was their point of reference, and that's an amazing thing to think about, that it's that recent, that our own grandfathers, great-grandfathers, great-grandmothers actually lived in the shadow of the war.
We have just a couple more minutes left. So one more quick question about other historical analogs. Are there any real life characters outside of Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, who we've already talked about? Are there other characters drawn from real life and the influences that you've described and the people who you've dedicated the book to?
No, I don't think so. There's Grant, and Grant is mentioned. And of course, the battle as it's described is very much based on my research. The journeys they make are based on research. And I think the fact that I could go to the asylum, which I visited it several times, every time I went home, so to speak. And many of the photographs I took myself. My research really formed such an important element in the book, because the picture I took of the room in the asylum, the bedroom, for instance, which is beautiful on my website because you can see it in color. I decided that would be the room that Connolly and her mother inhabited. And many of the pictures from historical societies and West Virginia University archives, like the dining room with the linen, with the tablecloths and the linen napkins in the cups, and the formality and the grace of it, the nurses' uniforms as they were at the time. All of these things became quite real. And when I found the photograph of the 4 soldiers standing outside in this very kind of unposed way, and learned that it was 4 members of the Bloody 7th West Virginia Cavalry, dedicated to the Union from the very beginning, because if people were going to fight for the South, they had to leave the state to sign up. Everyone who signed up in West Virginia was fighting in this new state for the Union. And the tallest figure to the far left became, in my mind, an image of the man who really is the soul of the book, the nameless man who, well, I don't want to do any spoilers here for those who haven't read the book, but we trace namelessness and the idea of moving through your life defined by others, as so many of us are, and certainly in wartime. It was wonderful to think that I had an image of him in my mind, which came from this photograph.
Yeah. I think that about runs us out of time. Thank you again, Jayne Anne, for joining us. It was just such a pleasure and an honor to have the chance to talk to you, and thank you for penciling us into your busy schedule. Thank you all for joining us on the live feed. This has been a virtual presentation of Club Book, a long-running literary series of MELSA made possible by the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Special
Well, I'd
thanks.
like to thank Book Club and especially thank you because it's been a great conversation. And I'm so glad to be spiritually there in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Thank you. Before you log off, look for the Club Book survey link, which is in the comments and will be projected in place of this video momentarily. Last, consider joining Club Book this Wednesday, October 9th, for their next program, this one in person at the Scott County Library in Savage, and featuring internationally best-selling historical fantasy writer Yanxi Chu, author of Ghost Bride, The Night Tiger, and most recently, The Foxwife. You can learn more about that and other upcoming events at clubbook.org. Thanks again, Jayne Anne. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.